This is going to be very interesting because we're going to have a conversation, or at least I'm going to ask questions, of Dr. Brenda Milner. Now, this is a fantastic woman. She's very active, and she's 96 years old. She's a neuropsychologist. She has contributed really extensively to the literature in clinical neuropsychology. Now, she was born in Manchester, England, got her PhD under Donald Hebb at McGill, that's in Canada, and has lived in Canada ever since. She joined Wilder Penfield at the Montreal Neurological Institute in 1950 and has published papers with some of the key people in the field, Penfield, William Beecher Scoville, and she's the Dorothy Killam Professor of Psychology in Montreal at the Neurological Institute. She's in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery. Now, she's a pioneer in neuropsychology, and particularly on the study of memory. And she has spent years working with a very famous patient who is referred to as HM, and described the deficits in this patient to the point where she was the person who understood and reported that the median temporal lobe amnesic syndrome, that is, the ability to learn, to acquire memories, and to recall, precisely where it's located in the brain, and was, I guess, the first to really map the brain in a very precise way. And it's really amazing. She's been the winner of the Dan David Prize, and this year recipient of the Kavli. Man, I like that. 96 years old and still running full steam. I think that's terrific. It's my hero, actually. Okay, we're absolutely thrilled to have a chance to talk to you. So let's start with your background. Now, you were homeschooled as a kid, a child, and your father taught you classics and music. So you didn't have very much exposure to science. How did you become a scientist, such an accomplished scientist?
Well, that's quite a long way from when I was 5 or 6 to when I was grown up. I was attracted to the sciences. My father died when I was 8, and we had very little money, and I had to get scholarships. And I knew I wanted to go to Cambridge and do mathematics. And my school wanted me to go to Oxford and do languages. I was very good at languages, but I really loved mathematics. And I managed to get to scholarships and get to Cambridge, Neurological College in mathematics. But after 1 year in mathematics, I passed my exams, but I realized I was never going to distinguish myself because there's a perceptual side to mathematics, which I hadn't realized. I thought it was just logic, but there's more to it than that. And I realized this was not, I was sad, but it was not really my field. And then the question was what to choose. And so I thought, well, mathematics, well, I should do logic and something, and that's in the moral sciences track. That's how subjects were grouped in Cambridge. And then people said to me, but Brenda, don't you have to earn your living? And I said, well, of course I have to earn my living. You know, we were as poor as the proverbial church mice. So they said, well, nobody ever earned their living in philosophy. So what about psychology, which happened to be grouped? This was before World War II. This was 1937. It happened to be grouped as a moral science with ethics and philosophy and so on. And so I knew nothing about psychology. We had a famous psychologist in Cambridge, Professor Bartlett, and I tried psychology and I took to it. I found that I was a good observer. I'm not a theoretician, you know, I don't have great theories, but despite my love of mathematics, I'm not a theoretician. But I am apparently, I mean, one takes these things, you take the things you're good at for granted, I think. And I'm apparently a very good observer of behavior and so on. I just thought everybody was. I think I'm very nosy, and so I notice things. Anyway, be that as it may, it turned out that I did very well in psychology at Cambridge. And I got a scholarship to continue at Cambridge for another 2 years. But at that moment, World War II broke out, and so we were all put on research connected with the war. And I was working on a radar research establishment in England during the first few years of the war. And that's where I met Peter Milner. I was Brenda Langford then. I met Peter Milner, who was a physicist from Yorkshire. And we got along very well until Peter was sent to, we knew the war in Europe was coming to an end, and Peter was sent to be sent to Canada for a year, they said, to study the beginnings, set up the beginnings, with a group of scientists, of course, to set up the beginnings of atomic energy research in Canada. And I was all set to go back to Cambridge, you know, my ideal place, which I loved. But somehow it wasn't the moment to say goodbye, and so we got married. You had to do that in those days to travel together. And we got on a plane, and we didn't know where we were going to end up, somewhere in Canada, but we didn't know where. We started in Boston, and then were told that we were going to Montreal. And this was wonderful, because I'd had this love of French. You know, people wanted me to do modern languages, as I told you, at school, and I chose maths. But I had kept my French going. I said I can keep French going, reading a lot of books and novels and so on. And there I was in a French-speaking city. It's a bilingual city, Montreal. But the first job I got in Canada was at the French-speaking Université de Montréal, not McGill, University of Montreal. And I taught psychology there, experimental psychology, for 7 years at the University of Montreal, and my French became much better. And in the middle of all this, came to the famous psychologist and came to McGill University. And I started taking a seminar with him. And, well, then you must have another question now. You've got me into my field and into Canada and at McGill. What's your next question?
Well, that's wonderful. Didn't you have any obstacles along the way? Did you have any obstacles or barriers? Obstacles or barriers to your career? Were there any blockages to your career when you were studying? Yes. Was there any impediments or problems?
No, it was just financial. You had to get scholarships for everything that you did, and by choosing mathematics, I made it a little more difficult for myself. But I managed to get the scholarships I needed, and we had no money. And when I got to Canada and have arrived, I was very lucky, because we have the Neurological Institute, which is where I'm sitting now, in Montreal, founded by Wilder Penfield, actually for the surgical treatment of epilepsy, but it's a very fine neurological institute. And Donald Hebb, the psychologist who was my professor at McGill when I decided I had to do a PhD at McGill while I was a professor at the University of Montreal. We didn't do PhDs in England in those days. It wasn't considered necessary. So he sent me up to the neuro. He got permission from the neurosurgeon Penfield that he could send one graduate student to study the patients who were undergoing elective surgery for the treatment of focal epilepsy, usually in the temporal lobe, sometimes in the frontal lobe of one hemisphere. And so I went there and did my PhD on that, and I got really addicted. I got my PhD in 52, but I got really to love the neuro and the environment of the neuro. And Hebb, of course, was happy to have me as a professor at the French University, teaching his theories in French. That suited him. And he assumed that, and jobs were tough in the 50s. Those were hard economic times. And so he thought that as soon as I got my PhD, I would continue at the Université de Montréal, and that was fine, with a safe job. And then I said to him, oh, I want to stay at the neuro. It's so wonderful. It's so exciting. And he was very shocked. And he said, "You are a fool." Ken was very blunt-spoken maritimer. He said, "You are a fool." But he said, "If you insist, I will support you for 1 year out of my funds, and you can do some more research for a year. But you are a fool." And so I stayed with a base in the psychology department at McGill, going up and testing, continuing my research at the Neuro. And by the end of that year, we had run into, you think HM is the first, he certainly wasn't, he was not we ran into 2 cases of memory loss after one of our unilateral temporal removals at the Neuro, 2 patients, PB and FC. And Penfield became very worried because the surgery for epilepsy is elective. It's not because a patient has a life-threatening brain tumor or stroke, it's because he's trying to get rid of epilepsy, which can be more or less controlled with medication, but not very well. So elective surgery, and you suddenly lose your memory forever. This is not a good exchange, so it worries the neurosurgeons. And we had 2 such cases, and this was when Penfield, the great Dr. Penfield, was quite a famous figure, founded this institute. He said, you have to come to the Neuro. We need you. The great Dr. Penfield was saying, we need you. And so that was the beginning. I gave up my job reluctantly at Université de Montréal because I loved teaching in French. But I moved to McGill and moved to the Neuro. And I'm still here. I'm still here at my age. So I obviously like the place. That's how I got here.
Tell us about HM. Tell us about that famous patient.
Well, I mean, again, this didn't begin with HM. It all began here in Montreal at the Neurological Institute. That the operations, the temporal lobe operations for epilepsy, and to this day it's the same thing, we're still doing that, were removal of one temporal lobe in the left hemisphere or the right, depending where the seizures were coming from, but unilateral. You can get along with one eye or one ear, or you can get along with one temporal lobe with only minor deficits, depending on the side of the lesion. But without 2, it's very bad. So we suddenly had 2 patients, an engineer and a glove cutter, I remember, PB and FC, and in fairly rapid succession, only a few months apart. And after the temporal lobe removal, and in the case of PB, the engineer, the removal was only a second operation, which was just taking the medial structures, the hippocampus and amygdala, in the left temporal lobe, because the overlying cortex had been removed 5 years ago. And after this operation, I remember this very bright patient, I had tested him beforehand, before the surgery, of course, and he just looked at us and he said, "What have you people done to my memory?" And he couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast, and his wife had been to visit him. He didn't remember, had a little retrograde amnesia, so he couldn't remember me, because he'd just met me a day or 2 before, though he knew, of course, things from further back. And so Dr. Penfield was very shocked, because elective surgery, you don't have people lose their memories. And then, as I say, a few months later, we had a similar case, because we dismissed the first one by saying, because what you have to remember, as I always tell students, and it may be hard for you younger people to remember this, is that back in the 50s, all we had in the way of knowing about the brain before the operation was the plain films of the skull, the size of the ventricles, the little bit of rather primitive EEG, which was guiding us in the choice of where the seizures were coming from. But nothing else, no MRI, no fMRI, nothing, none of those luxuries. And so you could sort of make mistakes more easily. And so we speculated that in these 2 patients, there was damage unsuspected by us before the surgery, damage in the equivalent region of the opposite hemisphere. These both happened to be removals in the left hemisphere, but in the right hemisphere, we speculated that there was atrophy in the hippocampal region of the right hemisphere, because the second operation in the case of PD had just involved that structure. And so we proposed this. This is long before HM. We proposed these at the American Neurological meetings in Chicago in 1950. 1953 I gave this talk, and the abstracts were circulated before the meeting. And a neurosurgeon in Hartford, Connecticut, Dr. William Scoville, called Penfield and said, I think what you and Dr. Milner are describing, this memory loss, is what I have seen in a patient in whom I did my operation. And I would like to invite Dr. Milner to come down to Hartford and test this patient and any other of my patients that may interest her. And that's how a young woman, a youngish woman from Canada, ended up going down to Hartford, Connecticut to study these patients. I mean, Scoville could just as easily have gone to his own University of Yale and asked for a psychologist. It hadn't occurred to him. It was when Penfield and I were reporting these cases from Montreal that he realized that this memory loss we were describing was what he had seen in his patient, HM. And so that's how I came to go down to Hartford and to meet HM and to start, the rest is history, so to speak. But it all started in Montreal.
That's fantastic. If you were starting out today, what kind of research and what approaches would you take? If you were starting to do research today, what area would attract you?
You're assuming today's world with all our fancy imaging, and you're assuming my position of privilege here at the Neuro. What would I think?
Yes.
What do I think now one should be doing, except that I'm rather old personally to do it,
Yes.
not with very great vigor. Well, I am interested, actually, in the interaction between the two hemispheres of the brain. I had the opportunity, I became good friends with Roger Sperry, who got the Nobel Prize for his work on split brain patients at Caltech, another approach to epilepsy. And Roger had invited me some years ago to study those patients, and I had studied them. And of course, what he was interested in was the communication across the hemispheres and so on. They're very exciting. But what interested me was that either hemisphere by itself was so stupid. I mean, we took down tasks that we use here in Montreal with our epilepsy patients with fairly low IQs, a lot of them, and we found that the patient, when you worked with one hemisphere, the left hemisphere, which was speaking hemisphere in those patients, or we did it by touch. If you're working with the right hemisphere, you work with the left hand behind the screen, so this successfully with a corpus callosum section, this keeps the left hemisphere out of the act, and vice versa. What we were finding that either hemisphere alone is really pretty incompetent, doing what it does best. The left hemisphere doing verbal tasks, the right hemisphere doing spatial tasks, memory tasks. They're pretty incompetent compared with our patients matched for IQ, chosen to match them for IQ, with epilepsy and so on, but with intact chronometers. So I became very interested in, actually, people used to joke about the corpus callosum, and what does it do? It just, keeps the two hemispheres from falling apart. But it seemed to me that this interaction between the hemispheres was vital. It was tremendously interesting. And now, with a grant I got from the Boltzmann Foundation 5 years ago, I would start this. They wanted to know, what are you going to work on? I got this letter 5 years ago, we're giving you this prize, what are you going to work on? And I thought, my God, I'm going to start work, I'm not that young. And I thought, I have this outstanding question about hemispheric interaction. And so I said I'm going to work on hemispheric interaction. And of course now we have imaging methods, so we can work with people with normal. That was the other change, that was so exciting. That the beauty of the Neurological Institute was that we had beautiful focal lesions, and it gave us a very special patient population. But now suddenly with imaging, you actually can study the normal human brain in action. That was quite intoxicating. The first PET studies which we had here, and now the functional MRI, we've gone overboard with that a little perhaps, but these new tools were quite extraordinary. So I suppose that's what I'm interested in. On memory tasks, because I really got into memory, I think, after my past, and now I have two postdocs and they're working on some memory tasks related to how the two hemispheres work together using functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Well, you are quite fantastic. Now you have an audience of some very brilliant women scientists. Do you have advice for them? Do you have any advice for the audience?
To advise an audience?
Yes.
An audience, but these are brilliant. These are not students you're talking about.
No, these are the audience comprises some very competent and productive scientists, women, all women. So
we're all women. Well, you know, one of the things I really you won't agree with this.
We have one tall white male.
But I don't have problems about being a woman. Maybe I've just been lucky. The only problem I had being a girl was when I had to get a scholarship to Cambridge in mathematics, because in those days, 1937, there were just 2 women's colleges at Cambridge. I knew absolutely I wanted to go to Cambridge and not Oxford. I knew absolutely I wanted to do mathematics and not languages or literature. And I had to get a scholarship. And there I was competing with other women, with other girls, not with men, with women's colleges. That was the toughest fight I had, I think. I never felt disadvantaged here at being a woman. I've never felt disadvantaged at the Neurological Institute. There were not as many women as men, but that's for all sorts of reasons, but not because we were treated differently or discriminated against. So I have advice in general for young students, which has nothing to do with gender. It's for people in general, young adults. Don't be afraid to change your field. I mean, I did that with success, but I know a lot of people who have found themselves in the wrong field. In my case, I was doing mathematics. I would never have been a great mathematician. I would love to have been. I think mathematics is wonderful, but I don't have it. And I was disappointed that I found something else I could do. So, you can start off on the wrong path, and you can suddenly discover what really interests you or what you're really good at, and then don't be afraid to switch. That's my advice in general. But if your audience is eminent scientists, they've already had a successful involvement in their career, they're not likely suddenly to change. but for people at the PhD level and so on, they find they've made a wrong choice. Don't be afraid to change.
Now, you have received the Kavli Prize.
Sorry, I don't hear you very well.
You have received the Kavli Prize.
Yes.
And the Dan David Prize.
Yes.
How has this assisted your research? Are you continuing to do research?
Yes, I am. I told you I'm continuing. But they were not the first prizes I got, I've had prizes a few years earlier than that have helped me with my research. It's very nice because it means I don't have to sit down and write grants. This is, I think we'll all agree that that's very nice.
Is there anyone in the audience? Because
the honor meant, it's very, of course, it's very gratifying if you travel, and I love Europe, and I went to Israel for the first time for this Israeli prize, and took my postdocs with me. I took 2 postdocs with me for the company. No, it's very exciting. I love getting honors. And it's very facilitating because it means that if I want to do more research, I don't have to apply for grants or start competing with young people, and which is. I probably won't get the grants, but if I did, it's rather unfair at my age to be taking it away from me, and so on and so forth. So to be given an award and encouraged, and that's what I'm going to work on, and it makes me feel good, it's nice. My mother lived to be 95, and she taught music, not in my field at all. She taught music till she was going deaf. And I'm really, really lucky in my genes, I think.
Yeah, I think. Well, we're very lucky. Yeah, Dr. Milner. My name is Mady Hornig, and I studied with somebody who studied along with you with Donald Hebb. Her initials were HM. Her name was Helen Mahout, who wrote The Monkey and the Seahorse. And I know very many stories of the time at McGill and the Neurological Institute, and I was always fascinated by how exciting it was as a time in cognition and memory and brain sciences.
Yes, this is Head. Head was a remarkable man, you know. My ex-husband, Peter Milner, was a physicist. I came to Canada with Peter. Peter was a physicist, and he was at Chalk River when I was here with Head, and I wrote long letters to him about Head. And Peter changed his field to psychology and became a psychology professor at McGill just because of Head, you know. He was a remarkable man.
Yeah, but do you remember Helen Mahut? She did research
yes,
on memory.
Yes, I know Helen Mahut. I taught her at one time.
Yes, absolutely. She had, it's so
yes,
interesting.
I knew Helen Mahut.
Do you have any favorite stories to tell the audience?
I'm not good at I tell stories as I talk, as you realize, but I'm not good at telling a story, finding a story and telling it.
One last question. You essentially founded cognitive neuroscience. This came about over the years.
Yes.
Do you have any advice for those going into the field that you founded?
Well, what I said, try to find a question that interests you, and make use of the technology. There's a danger with all the new technology that the technology will run away with the science, that people will think if they're using FMR or PET or something that they're doing good science necessarily, and of course it's not true. They're filling up the journals, but you still have to have the idea, I think. I don't know that, apart from this general advice of don't be afraid to change fields if it tempts you, it's a good idea. But I don't have particular advice. I haven't had difficulties, you know, and my only difficulties were financial always, and I had, and also my obstinate determination to do science when it would have been a lot easier for me if I'd gone into languages, which I know I'm good at. But you know, I've often thought, because I was in England during the first 5 years of the war, and we scientists were in reserved occupation. We didn't join the services, we stayed at home and did research in the war. But if I had gone into the arts, as people wanted me to do, and I had become proficient in French and German and so on, as I'm sure I would have, they might have been dropping me over France or over Europe to do something. I might be dead. So I think that I'd be very lucky in my obstinacy, perhaps, about what I wanted to do.
Well, thank you. Oh, wait a minute. Yes?
Can you ask her about the secret for a long life, other than
Oh.
her and not being bombed?
The question from the audience is, what's the secret to the long life that remains so productive?
That's genes, you know. You start with genes.
Thank you very much. You are absolutely wonderful, and we appreciate your giving us time today. Thank you on behalf of all.
This is from Canada.
My alma mater.
We have a Montreal student here from McGill. From McGill.
McGill.
A geneticist who is studying genes.
Does she have anything to say to me?
Thank you. You're beautiful.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.